For most of human existence, the planet offered no sense of balance. Earth was restless, unpredictable, often unforgiving. Climate did not follow gentle cycles, but swung between extremes, reshaping landscapes again and again. Ice advanced, then retreated. Forests vanished, then returned. Rivers shifted their paths, coastlines moved, and entire regions transformed within the span of a few generations. This was the world in which humanity emerged. This long and unstable chapter of Earth's history is known as the Pleistocene. Contrary to the popular image of a frozen, static ice age, the Pleistocene was defined by constant fluctuation. Periods of intense cold were repeatedly interrupted by warmer intervals, only for glacial conditions to return once more. These oscillations dominated the planet for hundreds of thousands of years, forcing every living species to adapt or disappear. Massive ice sheets expanded across much of the northern hemisphere, burying vast areas beneath kilometers of frozen water. Regions that are now densely populated were once locked beneath ice, while others became open grasslands and cold steppes. When temperatures dropped, water was trapped in glaciers, causing sea levels to fall dramatically. When the ice melted, oceans rose again, swallowing coastlines and reshaping continents. Before we dive in, drop your location in the comments and subscribe to Primal Roots if you're enjoying the journey. During periods of low sea level, land bridges emerged where oceans now exist. Entire continents became connected. These temporary corridors allowed animals and human populations to move across regions that would later become impassable. Migration was not driven by curiosity or ambition, but by necessity. When resources disappeared, movement became survival. Human groups followed shifting ecosystems, adapting to cold, dry, and often hostile environments. Survival required constant awareness. Knowing when to move mattered as much as knowing where to go. The landscape was never permanent, and neither were the opportunities it offered. The animal life of the Pleistocene reflected these harsh conditions. Large-bodied species dominated. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, woolly rhinoceroses, and other massive herbivores roamed open plains and frozen tundras. Thick fur, slow metabolisms, and enormous bodies helped them conserve heat and survive long winters. Predators were equally formidable, adapted to hunt large prey across vast territories. Energy in this world was concentrated in giants. Humans existed within this system, but they did not control it. They lived under constant pressure from forces far greater than themselves. Hunting large animals demanded cooperation, planning, and risk. Failure could mean injury, starvation, or death from exposure. Gathering plants supplemented diets, but depended heavily on season, location, and shared knowledge of the land. Nothing was guaranteed. As the Pleistocene progressed toward its final stages, climatic instability intensified. Changes that once unfolded over tens of thousands of years began occurring more rapidly. Regions that had supported abundant wildlife became drier. Others, once frozen, experienced seasonal thawing. Lakes formed and vanished. Rivers altered their courses. Entire ecosystems reorganized within the span of human lifetimes. This volatility shaped human behavior. Flexibility became more valuable than specialization. Small, mobile groups had better chances of survival than rigid, settled ones. Knowledge was not written down, but carried through observation, experience, and oral tradition. Memory became a tool as essential as any stone blade. Yet near the end of the Pleistocene, something unusual began to emerge. Evidence preserved in ice cores, ocean sediments, and fossil pollen reveals a distinct shift in climate behavior. The familiar pattern of repeated oscillations began to change. The rhythm of the planet itself seemed to slow, as if approaching a threshold. One of the most dramatic episodes of this final phase was the Younger Dryas. After an initial warming trend, temperatures suddenly plunged back toward near-glacial conditions across much of the northern hemisphere. This cooling was abrupt, unfolding quickly enough to be experienced across only a few human generations. Ecosystems that had begun to recover were once again pushed to their limits. But what makes this event remarkable is not just the return of the cold. When the Younger Dryas ended, the climate did not revert to the familiar cycle of instability. Instead, the planet warmed rapidly, and this time, the warmth persisted. Temperatures rose and did not fall back to previous extremes. Around 11,700 years ago, Earth crossed a critical threshold. Glaciers began a sustained retreat. Sea levels started to rise steadily, flooding ancient migration routes and reshaping coastlines. Cold steppes gradually gave way to forests, wetlands, and more productive landscapes. While challenges remained, the environment became less extreme, more predictable. For the people living through this transition, there was no awareness of a new geological era. There were no names, no markers, no sense of historical turning points. What they noticed instead were practical changes. Seasons became more regular. Plants returned to the same places year after year. Animals adjusted their migration patterns. Certain locations became reliably productive. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, the world seemed to slow its chaos. This shift did not bring immediate abundance or safety. It introduced new pressures. Large animals, finely tuned to cold environments, began to struggle. Some populations declined sharply. Others vanished entirely. The ecological balance that had defined the Pleistocene was unraveling. Humans were once again forced to adapt, but the nature of the challenge had changed. Survival was no longer dominated by reacting to extreme cold or relentless instability. It now involved understanding an environment that followed different rules. A world where staying could sometimes be as advantageous as moving. A world where patterns could be observed, remembered, and anticipated. Without realizing it, humanity was leaving behind the conditions that had shaped its biology, behavior, and way of life. The Pleistocene, the age of instability, was coming to an end, and with it, a mode of existence that had defined the species for nearly its entire history. What would replace it had no name yet, no clear form, but the foundations of a new world were already being quietly laid. As the new climate took hold, subtle signals began to ripple through ecosystems across the planet. The change was not sudden or uniform, but patterns emerged again and again in distant regions. Animals that had once been common became harder to find. Familiar migration routes fell silent. Hunting grounds that had sustained generations yielded less with each passing season. The world that had supported enormous creatures for tens of thousands of years was no longer able to maintain them. The great mammals of the Pleistocene had evolved for a specific kind of planet. Their massive bodies conserved heat. Thick coats protected them from relentless cold. Slow reproductive cycles made sense in a world where stability came from size, strength, and endurance rather than speed. Vast territories provided enough food to sustain their enormous energy demands. These traits were advantages in a frozen, open landscape shaped by long winters and short growing seasons. But as temperatures rose, those same traits became liabilities. Cold-adapted grasslands began to shrink. In many regions, dense forests replaced open steppes. Vegetation changed in both composition and structure. Plants that thrived in icy, dry conditions were gradually overtaken by species better suited to warmer, wetter environments. For giant herbivores, this meant less accessible food and greater effort required to move across increasingly fragmented landscapes. For large predators, the consequences were even more severe. Fewer prey, shrinking hunting ranges, and rising competition. The decline of the megafauna did not occur as a single catastrophic event. It unfolded as a cascading process. Populations thinned, became isolated, and lost genetic diversity. Smaller groups were more vulnerable to disease, droughts, or unusually harsh seasons. In an already stressed system, even minor disruptions could push entire species beyond recovery. By this time, humans were present on nearly every continent. They were not newcomers struggling to survive, but highly adaptable predators capable of learning, cooperating, and transmitting knowledge across generations. Their tools became more refined, their strategies more precise. Hunting increasingly relied on understanding animal behavior rather than chance encounters. The relationship between humans and megafauna was complex. In many regions, people and large animals had coexisted for thousands of years without triggering collapse. Yet the conditions of the late Pleistocene altered that balance. Climate pressure reduced animal populations, while human efficiency steadily increased. Together, these forces created a breaking point. Each large animal killed represented an immense concentration of energy. Meat, fat, bone, sinew, and hide. For human groups living in uncertain environments, such a resource was impossible to ignore. But unlike smaller animals, giants reproduced slowly. Losses that could once be absorbed became permanent. The equilibrium maintained by vast territories and low human densities began to fail. As the great animals disappeared, ecosystems entered a phase of deep reorganization. Large herbivores had shaped the land in fundamental ways. By grazing selectively, trampling vegetation, dispersing seeds, and altering soil structure, they maintained open environments and influenced plant diversity. Their absence triggered changes that spread throughout entire ecological networks. Open landscapes closed in, forests thickened, natural fire regimes shifted. Some smaller animals thrived in the new conditions, while others declined. The planet was not simply warming, it was beginning to function differently. For humans, this transformation created a paradox. The loss of large prey removed a crucial source of food and materials. At the same time, environmental diversity increased. Smaller animals became more prominent in the diet. Plant foods, roots, seeds, fruits, and tubers, grew in importance. Survival now depended on exploiting a wider range of resources. This transition demanded new skills. Hunting smaller, faster animals required precision, patience, and intimate knowledge of local terrain. Tools diversified. Traps, nets, projectiles, and specialized implements emerged independently in different regions, reflecting similar solutions to shared challenges. Technology became increasingly local, shaped by specific environments rather than universal needs. Social organization also began to shift. Large communal hunts had required extensive cooperation and produced temporary surpluses. With smaller and less predictable prey, sharing became more frequent, but yields were lower. The risk of scarcity increased, encouraging groups to remain closer to reliable resources. Gradually, certain locations gained importance. Areas with consistent access to water, edible plants, and manageable game became places of repeated return. These were not permanent settlements in the modern sense, but familiar landscapes revisited season after season. Over time, these places were mapped in memory, shaped by experience and exploited more intensively. Mobility remained essential, but it changed in character. Long, unpredictable migrations gave way to shorter, more regular movements. The land was no longer just something to pass through. It became something to understand, anticipate, and manage. Meanwhile, the disappearance of the megafauna continued. Across different continents and at different times, the outcome was strikingly similar. Species that had survived multiple glacial cycles failed to withstand the unprecedented combination of a rapidly changing climate and sustained human pressure. Earth was entering a new biological phase. There was no sense of intent or destruction behind these changes. Humans did not perceive the cumulative impact of their actions over centuries. Each decision was immediate and local, aimed at feeding the group and surviving the season. Yet the collective effect was profound and irreversible. As large animals vanished, human influence over the environment increased. In some regions, controlled burning was used to clear vegetation, improve visibility, or encourage the growth of desirable plants. Landscapes began to reflect deliberate choices rather than purely natural processes. The boundary between adaptation and environmental modification grew increasingly thin. The human relationship with nature was shifting. No longer defined solely by reaction to extreme climatic forces, it became an ongoing interaction with a more stable but more sensitive environment. Climate no longer dictated constant retreat or desperate movement. Instead, it offered patterns that could be learned and exploited. The extinction of the megafauna represented more than biological loss. It marked the end of an energy system that had defined the Pleistocene. Massive bodies had concentrated resources into a few individuals. With their disappearance, energy became scattered across countless smaller organisms. Exploiting this new system required different strategies. Long-term planning became advantageous. Storing food, protecting productive areas, and investing time in activities with delayed returns began to make sense. Survival was no longer tied exclusively to the success of the next hunt. Without realizing it, humans were crossing an invisible boundary. The world of giants, dominated by cold and instability, was dissolving. In its place emerged an environment where accumulated decisions could shape future outcomes. The silence left by the great animals was not merely physical, it was functional. Their absence demanded new responses, new behaviors, and new relationships with the land. These responses, forged by necessity and opportunity, would soon lead to a transformation even more profound than the loss of the giants themselves. The planet had changed, the fauna had changed, and now the human way of life was beginning to reorganize at its core. With the gradual retreat of ice and the disappearance of the great animals that had dominated the planet for tens of thousands of years, Earth entered an unusual state. Change did not stop, but it softened. Climatic swings narrowed. Extremes became less frequent. Seasons began to follow recognizable rhythms. Patterns emerged where once there had only been volatility. For those living through this transition, the world was still demanding and often unforgiving. Survival required constant effort, physical endurance, and careful attention to the environment. Yet something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in an immensely long stretch of human history, the planet no longer behaved as a continuous threat. Instead, it offered signals that could be anticipated. Rain returned to the same regions at similar times. Certain plants sprouted predictably after known intervals. Smaller animals followed relatively stable routes. Lakes and rivers persisted instead of vanishing unpredictably. The planet, once a force that demanded constant movement, began to allow remaining in place. This relative stability altered how humans related to space. Observation now produced expectation. Expectation made planning possible. Where survival had once depended on immediate reaction, it could now include actions whose benefits would only appear months later. Plant gathering became increasingly selective. Some species were favored, revisited, and protected. Areas where edible plants naturally grew began to receive repeated attention. Without conscious intent to domesticate, human presence itself started to influence which plants thrived. Seeds dropped near campsites germinated more often. Disturbed soils favored certain species over others. Gradually, landscapes began to reflect subtle human preferences. A similar process unfolded with animals. Species that tolerated proximity to humans, fed on waste, or benefited from modified environments found new niches. The relationship between people and other organisms became continuous rather than episodic. The line separating natural ecosystems from human-influenced spaces began to blur. This transformation did not occur everywhere at the same pace. In some regions, stability was stronger and longer lasting. In others, climatic challenges persisted. Yet the broader pattern was unmistakable. The planet had entered a rare phase of climatic predictability. This interval would later be named the Holocene. Within this new context, unprecedented possibilities emerged. As resources returned reliably to the same locations, human groups reduced the scale of their movements. Mobility remained important, but it was reorganized. Long-distance migrations became less common, replaced by smaller seasonal circuits. Certain places gained central importance, not merely as temporary stops, but as anchors within a known landscape. Repetition bred familiarity. Familiarity fostered attachment. Places accumulated meaning, memory, and shared history. Land was no longer just terrain to cross. It became territory understood in detail and shaped by experience. Storage became a viable strategy. Preserving food for less favorable periods only made sense when there was confidence of returning to the same place. Techniques such as drying, burying, and protecting food from animals were developed and refined. Survival became less dependent on daily success and more on accumulated preparation. Time itself began to feel different. Planning extended beyond days or weeks to seasons and cycles. Anticipating future rains, plant growth, or animal movements became part of survival strategy. This expansion of temporal awareness reshaped decision-making and social behavior. With longer planning horizons came new forms of cooperation. Collective effort extended beyond single events like hunts and into ongoing tasks. Decisions increasingly affected not just immediate survival, but the future well-being of the group. Social structures grew more complex as responsibilities diversified. Stability, however, introduced new challenges. Remaining in one area increased pressure on local resources. Overuse became a risk. Management became necessary. The relationship with the environment shifted from simple exploitation to regulation and intervention. Without a grand plan or deliberate intention, humans began to reshape their surroundings. Vegetation was cleared. Fires were set to manage growth, attract game, or encourage useful plants. Water sources were protected or redirected. Certain species flourished while others declined. Landscapes became the product of cumulative human choices. This marked a profound break from the Pleistocene past. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity had been shaped primarily by external forces, especially climate. Now, humans themselves became a significant shaping force. Agriculture did not emerge as a sudden invention. It was the outcome of prolonged interaction, observation, and experimentation. Cultivation grew naturally from the desire for predictability in an environment that, while more stable, still carried risks. Plants once gathered began to be tended. Growth cycles were influenced deliberately. The boundary between wild and managed blurred further. Food production on a larger scale allowed populations to grow. Demographic expansion brought new pressures. Competition for space increased. Social coordination became more complex. Rules, hierarchies, and systems of authority began to form, not as abstract concepts, but as practical responses to managing larger groups. Change accelerated. Temporary camps evolved into permanent villages. Villages expanded into dense settlements. Labor became specialized. Not everyone needed to secure food. Some individuals focused on construction, tool-making, protection, record-keeping, or ritual. Knowledge diversified and accumulated. All of this unfolded within a remarkably short span when compared to the vast timeline of human evolution. After millions of years adapting to instability, only a few thousand years of relative calm produced most features associated with civilization. The contrast is striking. Sparse populations, simple tools, and mobile lifestyles gave way to dense societies, complex technologies, and global influence. This transformation depended on an unusually stable climate window. The end of the Pleistocene was more than a geological transition. It reversed the relationship between humans and the planet. Instead of being shaped primarily by environmental forces, humans increasingly shaped their environment. Yet this success carried an unseen dependency. Large populations, complex societies, and food systems relied on the very stability that made them possible. Civilization became tied to a narrow range of climatic conditions. For thousands of years, those conditions persisted. Civilizations rose and fell, but the underlying environmental framework remained relatively consistent. The memory of the chaotic Pleistocene faded, preserved only in natural archives and archaeological traces. Still, the planet retains that memory. Retreating ice, vanished animals, rising seas, and submerged lands tell a story of rapid transformation once critical thresholds are crossed. They reveal that stability is not permanent but conditional. The Holocene allowed humanity to flourish. It also revealed a fundamental truth. Civilization is not an inevitable outcome of human nature, but a fragile phenomenon sustained by specific environmental circumstances. The end of the Pleistocene marked the beginning of this extraordinary experiment. a brief pause in Earth's long history of change, during which a single species reshaped the world. Whether that pause continues has become one of the defining questions of the present. If this perspective changed how you see human history, follow the channel and keep exploring the deep roots of our past with us.